We are, without a doubt, living in the most challenging moment in Jewish history in the last 75 years. And this week's Torah reading, as Callie alluded to in her Devar Torah, speaks ironically directly to some of the issues that we as a people are again facing at this moment. The Torah says quite clearly in chapter 16, verse 22, V'nasa hasa'ir alav, and thus the goat shall carry on it, et kol avnotam el eretz gezerah, all of the iniquities to an inescapable region, v'shalach et ha'sa'ir bamidbar, and the goat shall be set free into the wilderness. This is the biblical ritual of Yom Kippur, very different than the ritual we have today. In this ritual, 2 goats are selected. One is offered as a korban, as a sacrifice to God, and on the other, the Kohen places his hands and transfers the iniquities of the people to the goat, and then that goat is set out into the wilderness to Azazel, a demon perhaps, a devil, who knows. And it's from this pasuk, from this verse in the Torah, that we get the idea of the scapegoat, of a goat that can somehow or other hold all of the iniquities of a people. There are some important differences between the use of the scapegoat in the Torah and the use of the scapegoat in modern parlance. In the Torah, all of our iniquities are put onto something else and then set free in the wilderness. It is a release. It's a transference of release rather than a transference of blame and responsibility. And that is the most important and essential element of the concept of the scapegoat within the Torah. In modern parlance, the scapegoat is anything but a release, but the scapegoat becomes the object, in many cases, the obsessive object of some blaming others for all of the ills of the society and civilization in which they're living. Further in the Parsha, we get a hint of one of the classic anti-Semitic tropes that are further in the Parsha. We get a hint of one of the classic anti-Semitic tropes that continue to our very day. And this trope is ironic because the Torah says, speaking about kashrut, Al ken amarti livnei Yisrael, therefore I said to the children of Israel, kol nefesh mikem lo tochal dam. Nobody's supposed to eat any blood. V'hagar hagar b'tochechem lo yochal gam, and neither shall any of the strangers who sojourn with you. This command related to blood is a famous and significant one, and it informs one of the pillars of keeping kosher, that we're not supposed to consume blood. In pagan times, that was something that was very common. You consume the blood, it's as if you're consuming the life force of the animal that you're eating. But for Jews, you're not supposed to do that. That's why our kosher meat is supposed to be soaked and salted so that you can remove as much of the blood before you consume the food. But today, this pasuk, this notion of eating blood, becomes the source, absurdly, of so-called blood libels, which continue to challenge us in new ways. Blood libels, by the way, go back to the Middle Ages, in which Jews were accused of using the blood of missing Christian children for Passover matzah or for hamantashen, apparently a key ingredient in the making of matzot. By the way, I still don't understand why we didn't have more than 18 minutes for the matzah to rise, but we had 4 hours for the brisket. And while I'm speaking about Pesach, you know why we opened the door for Elijah? One of the reasons is to open our door mythically, midrashically, symbolically for Elijah to feel welcome, that into our homes will come the prophet who ushers in the redemption of not only our people, but of the world. But there's a practical reason as well. In some communities in Poland in the Middle Ages, on Pesach night, a censor would go and knock on the Jewish doors, and you'd have to open the door so that the censor could determine whether or not you were using Christian blood in the making of your matzot for the holiday. Right? You can't make this stuff up. Right? That's an ancient blood libel. And the trope that Jews are responsible for the world's ills is connected to the notion that we are first and foremost loyal to our own communities, which of course has some truth to it. But the oldest trope of Jewish responsibility for the ills of the world is one that we heard again just last week, that we are responsible, if not directly for the death of Jesus, indirectly by turning him in to the Roman authorities. And it doesn't matter that the church in Vatican II in 1966 took 2,000 years, but said, no, that's not the case, and specifically wrote an opinion that corrected this historical anti-Semite. But members of the Republican Party in the U.S. House of Congress, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, did not vote for the anti-Semitism resolution, the international accepted anti-Semitic resolution, because they were concerned that Christians would be arrested for following that belief that Jews killed Jesus. 2024. You had not only Marjorie Taylor Greene, but Matt Gaetz from Florida also spewing the same anti-Semitic trope last week. And it's more modern day manifestations which we are seeing as well, go back to even 9/11. Why is it that so many Jews survived 9/11? Because the Mossad told the Israelis that it was coming, and that the Mossad is somehow responsible for 9/11. Or COVID. Or genocide. Or the blaming of Jews for ineffective government policy, where there's a new nickname for President Joe Biden. If you didn't hear it already, there's some who are calling him Genocide Joe. What's ironic is the very definition of anti-Semitism that some rejected, and even some here in Toronto, the University of Toronto, for example, will not institute the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism because they're afraid that it will stifle free speech and criticism about Israel. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that people don't know how to actually criticize Israel, right? Criticizing government policy is fair game. For example, Israel has proven, after Biden put the screws to Netanyahu about humanitarian aid, that it has the capacity to open up more corridors and to triple the amount of aid that's getting into to Gaza for the Palestinians. It's been tripled in the last 2 weeks since Biden made it very clear that there were going to be consequences if that wasn't the case. And there are many in Israel who have been saying all along that part of Israel's strategy in prosecuting this war should have been taking into account the suffering that the Palestinians were going to endure as a result of it. And they could have planned for greater humanitarian aid access from the get-go, and at the very least would have taken away any legitimate criticism that Israel wasn't doing enough to minimize the loss of innocents in the war. Daniel Hartman went so far as to suggest in one of the podcasts that he and Yossi Klein Halevi do, Yossi's going to be here in a week, went so far as to suggest that Israel that goes all over the world in disaster zones and sets up field hospitals could have set up field hospitals for the Palestinians as well. Now, psychologically, I understand why Israelis were not so willing to think about helping the Palestinians. They were thinking about minimizing civilian death and casualty, that's for sure. But they weren't so willing to help Palestinians at the very beginning of the war because 3,000 Hamas terrorists came into Israel and killed 1,200 of our people and wounded 3,000 more. Psychologically, I understand that. But from a leadership level, from a policy level, that is legitimate criticism of government policy. See how easy it is? But to suggest that Israelis and Israeli doctors and the IDF is purposefully attacking innocents in this war, and that Israel is somehow or other responsible for genocide is a blood libel. Because the math just doesn't make sense. 34,000 Palestinians, if you take Hamas at its word, fine, then take Israel at its words too. 14,000 of them are combatants. That means there's 20,000 civilians that have been killed, unfortunately, as a result of this war. 20,000 out of 2.2 million people does not constitute a genocide. And the ratio of combatant to civilian, which we've shared before, but it's important to remember, it is 1 to 1.8. It's under 1.2, 1 to 2, where the average in war in the last 100 years is 1 to 9. So the math doesn't make sense for the claim, and therefore the claim can only be understood as a blood libel. And that's why one of the principles of the IRA definition is that accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews, is anti-Semitism and scapegoats the Jewish people. And this phenomena, unfortunately, in our day has mutated, especially with the advent of social media, which has made it infinitely easier for users to spread disinformation, to blame Jews for global problems, and spread hateful rhetoric. And it originates from both ends of the political spectrum and has manifested itself again through this war between Israel and Hamas. And the latest manifestation are these tent encampments popping up throughout university campuses in North America. Anti-Semites, writes the American Jewish Congress, not only attempts to use conspiracy myths to provide an easy and straightforward explanation for seemingly inexplicable things, but also uses them to confirm their prior beliefs. And that's part of the challenge that we have today. What was previously marginalized has found its way back into the mainstream and into the center. According to Dr. Daniel Gillay, who's a social psychologist at Northumbria University in Britain, who has written about conspiracy myths, the conspiracy myths people gravitate towards the most are often the ones that most mirror their existing biases. Therefore, it seems likely that the current war and anti-Semitic conspiracy myths that have emerged along with it have uncovered a deep reservoir of anti-Semitism and scapegoatism around the world. Yossi Klein Halevi, in this week's podcast, said in conversing about this topic with Daniel Hartman, he said that what's going on is an assault against my being. And he doesn't care, nor do I, quite frankly, if these people are anti-Semitic or not, whether or not they like Jews personally. Yossi said, they want to destroy my country, my home, the hope that has sustained the Jewish people for the last 70 years. And there's no greater threat to me at the moment than that. He continues, the motives of many, maybe most, are not classically anti-Semitic. And I think he's right. I think most people there really don't have a clue what the hell it is that they're protesting about. Definitely some are. If you look at the police statistics, in most universities other than Columbia University, less than half of the people arrested have been students. That means more than half of the people going there are outside agitators, right? So most of the people that are doing this probably don't have a clue as to what's going on. But it is an anti-Semitic moment, he says. When you criminalize the Jewish state and obsess over the sins, real or perceived, of Israel, far more than any other country, you fall into an old pattern, turning the Jew into a symbol of whatever civilization regards as its most detestable qualities. Human rights, anti-racism. The Jewish state becomes the symbol of racism and now genocide. And the burden of proof for Yossi is not on Jews to disprove anti-Semitism, or it's not on Jews to disprove that these claims are anti-Semitic. The burden of proof, he argues, is on those repeating these claims to show how it is not anti-Semitic. The Torah understood the psychological mechanism in creating the scapegoat because it created at its time what was a benign and helpful system. The goat wanders off to the wilderness. No one is hurt. But as my colleague and friend Rabbi David Wolpe writes, when the self-loathing turns outwards to other human beings, it creates havoc in the world. The havoc we're experiencing now. Fortunately, Torah provides a fix too. In the very word of the Torah reading this morning, acharei mot, it begins with the word acharei, after. After this happens, the challenge is, how do we react? How do we respond? Which, by the way, shouldn't be like the counter-protesters at UCLA who were throwing fireworks into the tent encampments. That's not how you do this. But we have normally what is a double portion in most years. This year is a leap year, so next year's portion is Kedoshim, but we normally read Acharei Mot Kedoshim together, and therein is an antidote. Acharei Mot, after death, after crisis, after difficulty, after challenge, comes holiness. Our response is holiness. Our response is sanity, is reasonableness. And, when necessary, to use all the levels at our disposal to provide for our safety and the safety of our neighbors. The Parsha Kedoshim contains what for Rabbi Akiva is the most important mitzvah of the entire Torah, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, to which Rabbi Hillel famously said, the rest is commentary. Go and learn. But I think there's also another response that the author David Grossman wrote about in the Hartman supplement for the Haggadah. And with this, I'll conclude. He writes about hope. I thought over and over again, trying to awaken it inside me. I called to it out loud in Hebrew, even perhaps it speaks Hebrew. Tikva, tikva. I thought about Israel's national anthem, which is called Hatikva, the hope, and speaks of the hope held by Jews for 2,000 years in exile, the hope of one day being able to live in their own country. It was a hope that often kept them alive. Hope is a noun, he writes, but it contains a verb that propels it into the future, always with forward motion. I love that idea. Hope is a noun. It's a noun that contains a verb. The implication is that hope is not simply an internal feeling. It is an actively asserted attitude that leads to action. I hope there is never another Holocaust is insufficient. Never again is a call to action that gives us hope. Hope is the Jewish students who, although scared, were not intimidated into silence. Hope is the faculty and administrators that spoke out against anti-Semitism and supported Jewish students. Hope is the fact that most citizens in this country, in the United States, and in other countries, as survey after survey continues to demonstrate, decry anti-Semitism and support Israel, even though they may disagree with some of its leaders and its policies. Hope is the aid package that has recently been voted on. Hope is U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken saying that Hamas is the obstacle to the ceasefire. Hope is the demonstrations for the release of hostages and those who wear necklaces and ribbons and strips of tape numbering the days that the hostages have been held. It's 211 days, by the way. Hope is knowing that Israel has an army and has put its life on the line in Gaza. Hope is knowing that the U.S. and Britain and France and Jordan helped stop the Iranian missiles that were aimed at Israel. Hope is every donation to help support the displaced in Israel. Hope is that after Yom HaShoah, the day in which we commemorate and remember the Holocaust, will come Yom HaTzmaut, the day in which we celebrate Israel's independence. And Israel still stands strong. And we stand with Israel. Symbolically, metaphorically, spiritually. And I'm going to ask you to rise, because we stand with Israel, and that is our hatikva. Tikva, hope, is a verb.